Good evening, everyone. I appreciate your coming to the 20th session in this combination course in Fireside about the Baha'i faith and its teachings. It is my hope that my presentation tonight and on each Wednesday at this same time will help stimulate thoughtful questions, useful answers, an abundance of sharing, and in the long run, an overview of the Baha'i teachings, its history, its administrative order, and its sacred text. Of course, as always, I remind you that these discussions are based on my understanding. What I say has no special authority, though I do base my observations on conclusions derived from my understanding of the text that are authoritative. Also, let me remind you that my ultimate goal is to provide you with the tools for your own study, not to fill your head with my personal observations. As you probably know, there is no clergy in the Baha'i faith, nor is there a recognized class of learned scholars. Every Baha'i is encouraged to study the Baha'i teachings independently, to discuss the teachings in gatherings such as this, and to teach others when the opportunity arises. These classes are not intended to substitute for the Rui Institute course, or the study circles as they're called, which are offered worldwide for Baha'is and the public in general to learn about the Baha'i teachings and how to put that learning into practice in order to help transform the individual, the neighborhood, and ultimately to create a framework for a global community. After my discussion of tonight's topic, Alex Kolodner, the director and producer of this online course, will select questions that you have typed into chat, which you can designate for everyone or only for Alex if you would rather remain anonymous. Do try to make your questions relevant to the topic for this evening. Finally, as usual, let me express my appreciation to my wife, Lucia, who helps me every week in creating and editing these presentations, and who, as usual, will begin our class tonight with a reading she has selected especially for this class. Lucia?
Lauded be thy name, O Lord my God. I am thy servant who hath laid hold on the cord of thy tender mercies and clung to the hem of thy bounteousness. I entreat thee by thy name, whereby thou hast subjected all created things, both visible and invisible, and through which the breath that is life indeed was wafted over the entire creation, to strengthen me by thy power, which hath encompassed the heavens and the earth, and to guard me from all sickness and tribulation. I bear witness that thou art the Lord of all names, and the ordainer of all that may please thee. There is none other God but thee, the Almighty, the All-Knowing, the All-Wise.
Thank you, Lucia. Well, let me shift my screen to the, well, let me first start sharing my screen. And I'll go to the PowerPoint for this evening. Tonight's topic, as you most probably know, is on the Sharia as it relates to feminism. It's probably going to be longer than we can get through the whole thing, but we'll do the best we can. First, we need to do a couple of prefatory slides that relate to how the Sharia relates to feminism or women as it evolves over time and as it evolves in the different divisions or sects of Islam. So if you remember, those of you who've been with the class all along, I showed you this slide many classes ago when we finished Christianity and saw how Christianity, which began sort of disorganized to begin with, but how early it split around, here with the Council of Nicaea. And then ultimately now is really not a single religion, but of course, many different religions with many different beliefs about who Christ was and what the purpose of Christianity is, and what practices involved in Christianity. Well, Islam doesn't get quite that divided, because it has at its core a single scripture with some sense of how the community should be organized, because Muhammad, of course, establishes, as we've already talked about, the ummah, or the community structure. And of course, there's a lot of guidance in the Quran about how to organize the community. So you see here, we have, of course, the two main branches of Sunni and Shia Islam. And then there's a third we haven't talked about, Faradi. And that's a group that fades away later on. But at the beginning, they were in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. They were a sect that appeared in the 1st century of Islam during the first fitna, or civil war. So you see, we already have in the 1st century, before Muhammad dies about halfway through the century, and then we have already have a civil war among the about the authority of Islam, and so you have a revolt against the authority of Ali once he became the 4th caliph. Now, we'll get on to that later. Suffice it to say that these were extremist, the Khawarij, and they become something extremist like contemporary ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So we first need to establish that it's difficult to understand how Muhammad deals with the fact that he, like all manifestations, knows that men and women are equal, that they always have been and always will be, but he's dealing with a situation where women have been treated as property. And of course, if you remember, we talked about the station or the state of this community in Arabia prior to Muhammad, which is called down here the times of ignorance, or Jahiliyyah, or Jahiliyyah, excuse me. And during that time, basically women were property that were owned by whoever happened to be the strongest conqueror in the latest war among the various tribes in that tribal culture. And so the result of the constant warfare, as I say on this slide here, is that you have a disproportionate number of women compared to men. Women had no independent means of protecting themselves or providing for themselves in this tribal culture. And even after Muhammad begins to impose order and rules and respect for women, you still had this same condition abiding. So sometimes the marriage, even after Muhammad, was, especially for women, widows and orphans, a token of respect and graciousness to protect them, more than it was a matter of, I've got more wives than you have. And of course, Muhammad limited the number of wives one could have to 4. And there's even a statement we'll look at later that infers that he may have really been advocating monogamy. Well, before we get into the surah that deals explicitly with the hijab and the other guidance from Muhammad about how a woman should comport herself, dress, and so on, and what station she had, you have the seven stages, if you will. They're really the period during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and then you have 6 different caliphates. Each caliphate was organized by a different clan or group or family or tribe, and each had a different place of as the central place. The Mecca was always the Qibla, the point towards which you turn when you say your prayers, but they had different cities that were their where the administrative order, the Caliph, would be, and so where the governance of Islam was stationed. Of course, you had Shia Islam, but it wasn't really that separate at this point. That comes later, or at least it didn't have a separate administrative order at this point. And so you had the first of the caliphs, which were those immediately following Muhammad, and then you have the Umayyad, the Abbasid, the Maluk, and the Ottoman. And the first ones, of course, were stationed in Medina. Then the second, the Umayyad in Damascus, the Abbasid built the city of Baghdad, specifically to be the headquarters for the religion. And then once you have the Turks, the Maluk Sultanate, you have a sultanate, which is the Caliph, but it's also called the Sultan from the Turkish concept of governance. And it changes from Baghdad to, of course, Constantinople. And that's where it remains during the time of Baha'u'llah, during the time of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks. Well, let's get into first establishing the essential verity that underlies, excuse me, all that we will be studying about the equality of men and women. And in this regard, I'm going to attach, in addition to the recording of this session, a session I did some time ago on the equality of women and men. And it's going to be titled 20A, and it's based on an article that I wrote that was published in the Association for Baha'i Studies on the equality of women and men. Baha'u'llah states unequivocally that women and men have been and will always be equal in the sight of God. Therefore, inasmuch as this verity is eternal, we cannot in one sense say that either Baha'u'llah or the Baha'i faith has caused women to be equal to men. They always have been. However, by unveiling this truth to humanity and by further inaugurating laws and institutions that embody and implement this reality, the manifestation empowers us to make this relationship, which already exists in the sight of God, extant in every aspect of human society as well. And so that's what we're in the process of doing. So you have first this isn't a verity, it's an observation about Islamic history, and that is, we know the names of so few women. We know the names, of course, mostly just of Khadijah, Muhammad's first wife, of Aisha, another wife of his who plays an important role in the history of Islam. And then you have, of course, Fatima, his daughter, the wife of Ali, the successor to Muhammad, or the intended successor. So in addition, you have in the Quran, you have the figure of Mary, the mother of Christ, is the only woman mentioned in the Quran by name. Most of the women in the Quran are represented as either the mothers or wives or leaders of prophets. They retained a certain amount of autonomy from men in some respects. For example, the Quran describes women who converted to Islam before their husbands or women who took an independent oath of allegiance to Muhammad. Now, when I say at the top, this also holds true from much of early Baha'i history. This is something that's discussed in the book by Janet Kahn on the most holy leave, the greatest holy leave. And she says that, you know, if you think about it, other than Tahireh and a handful of other women, we don't know many women in early Baha'i history because it was carrying on this same tradition. Well, the woman was sort of, if you will, a part of the family, but you knew the family by the name of the men. So we know the Asiya Khanum, Nawab, the wife of Baha'u'llah, and a few others. And that's the Bahiya Khanum, the greatest holy leave, and so on. Number of wives. Well, this is the first thing we'll deal with. This is the most obvious one that comes up. People are discussing the station of women in Islam, that Muhammad says that you can have 4 wives. Well, that was sounds to us as perhaps inappropriate, but of course, given the circumstances I've just described, it was a big step towards getting away from the idea the woman is just property. And in this surah, this is Surah 4, verses 3 and 4. Surah 4 is Nisa, the women. If you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with the orphans, marry women of your choice, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with them, then only one, or a captive, that your right hand possesses. That will be more suitable to prevent you from doing injustice. And give the women on marriage their dower as a free gift. Now, here is interesting because, again, in some cultures, the dower or the dowry is given from the family of the wife to the man. But here you have, and of course you have this in the Baha'i laws as well, the dower or the dowry is given from the man to the woman as a signal of her autonomy and her independence, her station. But he says, if they of their own good pleasure, free will, in other words, remit any part of it to you, take it and enjoy it with right good cheer. Now, this is a statement by, in a footnote, note 309 on page 179 of the translation of the Quran by Yusuf Ali. And this is his own thought, but it is interestingly parallel to the statement by Abdul Baha about what Baha'u'llah said about the number of wives one could have. The unrestricted number of wives of the times of ignorance, here the same thing before Muhammad, when things were just totally chaotic, was now strictly limited to a maximum of 4, provided you could treat them with perfect equality in material things as well as in affection and immaterial things. As this condition is most difficult to fulfill, I understand the recommendation to be towards monogamy. Now that's his understanding. And yet, of course, this is the same logic that Abdul Baha uses in defining the law of the Agdas as being restricted to monogamy. That because you cannot treat 2 people exactly the same, it is implicitly assigning monogamy. That's just a guess on his part, but it's worth sharing. Again, in the Surah 4, Al-Nisa, the women. Men are the protectors and maintainers of women because Allah has given the one more strength than the other. And this is something that Abdul Baha talks about, that throughout history, women have had a secondary position simply because history up until the modern era was based on physical strength. That is, ruling and power was. Power is now a thing of intellect. And he says, of course, in many instances or in many situations, women are not only equal, but superior to men. Abdul Baha says this. Therefore, the righteous women are devoutly obedient and guard in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. As to those women on whose part ye fear disloyalty and ill conduct, admonish them first, next refuse to share their beds, and last beat them lightly. But if they return to obedience, seek not against them means of annoyance, for Allah is most high, great above you all. One thing that's worth noting here, aside from this beating, and what is the origin of that word, and what exactly does it mean, because it's translated differently in different translations of the Quran, that almost every other few verses, Muhammad is constantly reminding the believers that all of this is from Allah, is from God, and always repeating the unique station of God, that God is aware of all you do, and God's only purpose in assigning these laws and this guidance is to assist you. You've got to remember that unlike Christ, who is following up with the Judaic concept of law, but he is still teaching about the same God. Well, here he's teaching a people where, even though there are Christian and Jewish tribes in Arabia at the time, for the most part, the tribal ethic abides. And so you don't have monotheism. Of course, you had 365 idols at the Kaaba before he cleansed it. So I asked one of my fellow scholars in translation, what is the Arabic meaning of the word strike here? And there are about 15 different words, all the way from punching or rapping or slapping or striking to something so mild as let's see, what is a mild one? Nudge with your elbow. I guess that's pretty. So I'm not asking you to accept this as being less than it is or other than it is, simply that, again, this is in a context where you have a man with possibly 4 wives and the wife has been disobedient. What does he do? Well, you have the same thing that Baha'u'llah does. You have alternative responses depending on the severity of the disloyalty and whether it's a recidivist wife or not. Consorts of the Prophet. Now here's where we get into the things about comportment and dress. That the consorts of the Prophet, and these, Muhammad had 2 wives that were particularly important to him, and that's Khadijah, who passed away, and then Asiya, who was quite young, died at 19. The rest were mostly widows, orphans, and so on, that he took as his wives simply to protect them. But they had a special station, and they also had a special comportment they were to abide by. And this describes that. O consorts of the Prophet, ye are not like any of the other women. If you do fear Allah, be not too complacent of speech, lest one in whose heart is a disease should be moved with desire. But speak you in a speech that is just, or appropriate would be the better translation there. And stay quietly in your houses. Now, again, in other words, don't flirt would be one way of translating that. So be careful what you say to a man, lest it invoke or evoke desire in their part. And stay quietly in your houses and make not a dazzling display like that of former times of ignorance. And establish regular prayer and give regular charity and obey Allah and his messenger. And Allah only wishes to remove all abomination from you, ye members of the family, and to make you pure and spotless. And again, you notice the thing of that Allah is always mentioned. Now, this concept of mutatis mutandis, this is a Latin legal phrase meaning the same for one as for the other. And it's a phrase that comes to play in the Baha'i teachings. You will find that all the laws regarding that use a male pronoun in the Kitabi Agdas, there is no neutral pronoun, of course, in English that you use, but in Arabic, which the Kitabi Agdas is in Arabic, the pronoun is neither masculine nor feminine, so it applies to both. So they put this phrase in, the House of Justice did, to make sure people understood that these laws apply equally to both. The same is true with the laws in the Quran, even though some Muslims don't believe that or don't accept that. It's absolutely true. For Muslim men and women, for believing men and women, for devout men and women, for true men and women, for men and women who are patient and constant, for men and women who humble themselves, for men and women who give in charity, for men and women who fast and deny themselves, for men and women who guard their chastity, and for men and women who engage much in Allah's praise. For them has Allah prepared forgiveness and great reward. It is not fitting for a believer, man or woman, when a matter has been decided by Allah and his messenger, to have any option about their decision. If anyone disobeys Allah and his messenger, he is indeed on a clearly wrong path. So this illustrates clearly that this particular admonition, which embodies in it, in this these two verses, three of the 5 pillars of Islam. It doesn't have the Hajj, though that's in another place in the Quran, that is the pilgrimage, but it does have charity, giving alms, prayer, and fasting, which are 3 of the 5 pillars. In general, the laws of the Kitabi Agdas, now this is a quote that you can see continues on, and it's in a preface to the Kitabi Agdas by the House of Justice. In general, the laws of the Kitabi Agdas are stated succinctly. Example of this conciseness can be seen in the fact that many are expressed only as they apply to a man, but it is apparent from the Guardian's writings that where Baha'u'llah has given a law as between a man and a woman, it applies mutatis mutandis, between a woman and a man, unless the context makes this impossible. For example, the text of the Kitabi Agdas forbids a man to marry his father's wife, his stepmother, and the Guardian, for example, his stepmother, also in addition to his stepmother, and the Guardian has indicated that likewise a woman is forbidden to marry her stepfather. This understanding of the implications of the law has far-reaching effects in light of the fundamental Baha'i principle of the equality of the sexes, and should be borne in mind when the sacred text is studied. That men and women differ from one another in certain characteristics and functions is an inescapable fact of nature and makes possible their complementary roles in certain areas of the life of society. But it is significant that Abdul Baha has stated that in this dispensation, equality of men and women, except in some negligible instances, has been fully and categorically announced. Now, of course, we come to the question that will always arise, well, why aren't women on the House of Justice? And Abdul Baha, of course, answers that, because that's certainly not a negligible instance. But he says the reason for that, if I can paraphrase it, has nothing to do with equality. It has to do with a circumstantial reason which will be made to know, will be made apparent and obvious as the sun at noonday when the time comes for you to understand it. In other words, and so if we can guess about it all we want, but the point is, if it's apparent as the sun at noonday, that we'll not only know it, but we'll know it when we know it, or know when we know it. Modesty and dress. And here again, this is explicitly aimed at the wives of the prophet. So to what extent is it sunnah, and to what extent is it meant as a paradigm for all women? It says believing women, so we have to assume that it is applicable to all women. O prophet, tell thy wives and daughters and the believing women that they should cast their outer garments over their persons when abroad, meaning when around, walking in the streets, when outside, so on. That is most convenient, that they should be known as such and not molested. So it's for their protection, not because they are not to be seen or a lesser value or something. And Allah is oft forgiving, most merciful. I love that he does this, just always reminding them this is of God, that God is aware of all you do. Muhammad's wives were the first women to follow the practice of veiling. So here's where we get into the explication of the hijab, and we'll get to the hijab verse in just a second. With hijab, Surah 33:53, commonly called the hijab verse, states that if believers want something from Muhammad's wives, they must ask from behind a hijab, meaning, in other words, the woman should be covered with a hijab. But the reason is very interesting. It also forbids believers from marrying Muhammad's wives after him, which you've already mentioned. The reason is that you're asking advice for them, is the inference I gain or glean from this, and that the information will be more discreet if you don't know who is giving the advice, sort of like the confessional, where you have the screen in the confessional in the Catholic Church. We'll get to that in a minute. As we have noted, surahs 3:32 through 34 declare that women of the prophet are not like other women, and so specifies special etiquette for them. And this is the hijab verse, surah 33:53. O ye who believe, enter not the prophet's houses until leave is given you for a meal, and then not so early as to wait for its preparation. But when you are but when you are invited, enter. And when you have taken your meal, disperse, without seeking familiar talk. Such behavior annoys the prophet. He is ashamed to dismiss you, but Allah is not ashamed to tell you the truth. So Muhammad will be polite and he won't tell you to leave after you've finished eating. But God's not so polite. God is more forthright with you. And when you ask his ladies for anything you want, ask them from before a screen. And this is the hijab. That makes for greater purity for your hearts and for theirs. Nor is it right for you that you should annoy Allah's messenger, or that you should marry his widows after him at any time. Truly such a thing is in Allah's sight an enormity. That's not a very good translation, that last one. But again, I'm using Yosef Ali. As I said last time, Rodwell is much smoother, and The Guardian much preferred it insofar as its eloquence is concerned. So this is what I'm talking about, that the purpose of the hijab was not to disguise the woman because she is less or because she is not to be seen, but to make the conversation or the advice not dependent on personality. Or at least that's my understanding. All the orthodox schools of Sharia prescribe covering the body in public. specifically to the neck, the ankles, and below the elbow. However, none of the traditional legal systems actually stipulate that women must wear a veil. It is only the wives of Muhammad who are instructed to wear this article of clothing, but for reasons much like the screen in a confessional, to maintain objectivity. And again, orthodox schools of Sharia are things that occur much later. These don't derive from things in the Quran. And we'll show you, if we get to them tonight, fine. If not, next time I'll show you the various schools of Sharia, how they evolved over time, and how they affected the status of women, and still do today. Such elderly women, this is Surah 2460. Such elderly women as are past the prospect of marriage, there is no blame on them if they lay aside their outer garments, provided they make not a wanton display of their beauty. But it is best for them to be modest, and Allah is one who sees and knows all things. So it's up to them to decide, but here is but be modest. And this is, you'll find this same guidance by Baha'u'llah about dress, both for men and women. Don't be the plaything of fools, he says. The comportment of women, this is Surah 2431. And say to the believing women, so this would apply to all Muslim women, that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty and ornaments except what must ordinarily appear thereof, that they should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty except to their husbands, their fathers, their husbands' fathers, their sons, their husbands' sons, their brothers or their brothers' sons, or their sisters' sons, or their women, meaning their attendants, or the slaves whom their right hands possess, are male servants free of physical needs, are small children who have no sense of shame of sex, and that they should not strike their feet in order to draw attention to their hidden ornaments. O ye believers, turn ye all together towards Allah, that ye may attain bliss. So this is a bit complex in the sense that what does ornaments mean? Their beauty and their ornaments. Well, there are a couple of several interpretations or translations of that, or explications of it. Here is one. In the specific context of women, the Quran speaks of covering women's ornaments from strangers outside the family. This latter verse of the Quran represents the institution of a new public modesty. New, in other words, that new to the days of Muhammad, and I'll show you a picture of the dress of women prior to Muhammad. When the pre-Islamic Arabs went to battle, Arab women, seeing the men off to war, would often bare their breasts to encourage them to fight, or they would do so at the battle itself, as in the case of the Meccan women led by Hind at the Battle of Uhud. This type of behavior is commonly seen by Islamic scholars and the broader Muslim public alike as emblematic of a state of spiritual ignorance. But one interpreter said they would do this to say, this is what you're fighting for, you know, this is what awaits you. So be sure and win. So you can see how debased and debasing the status of women, well, not the women weren't debased, but were treated in a debased manner and considered property and so on. This is one picture of the dress of women during the time of Muhammad. Rather beautiful and very individualistic, obviously. This is a painting of a woman studying the Quran in 1880. The particular culture or country is not made specific. But it's showing, obviously, that what we see of the complete covering of the woman in the black garbs and the veil and the hijab and so on, is something that emerged with the fanaticism of the Islamic Revolution in the case of Iran, and in the case of Arabia, I'll show you that in 1 second. This hyperlink here will lead you to a BBC, rather brief BBC video about the change in dress after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And it shows Iranian women, largely, as you're probably familiar, in Western garb, driving cars, doing everything that Western women do. And then after the Islamic Revolution, a complete change. And this is a very good video to demonstrate that. There is a book that I highly recommend by Tamara Son. She was a teacher at USF for a while and then attained a chair of a professorship at William and Mary, where she is an expert in Islam and Islamic culture and history, particular about women. This simply states that in the book, she argues a brief history of Islam against violence and inequality for women under Islamic law. What that means is she uses Islamic law to contend that no such treatment is recommended or countenanced, that this comes from what men clerics did later to the Sharia. And that's what we're going to see a little bit tonight and the rest of it next time. Says here she commends Morocco's Mudawana family code for the abolishment of the patriarchal family and the diction respecting women. The Sharia and the practice of Islam. Well, we'll get a little of this. The initial schism begets variations and inconsistencies in all but the most general beliefs and practices. So you have the Qur'an, but not its interpretation and application, as of course would have been the case had the Qur'an as collected by Ali in chronological order, and also the Qur'an as it would have been interpreted and applied by the imams. As we will see later, when Ali became, he was offered to be the caliph, the third caliph after the second caliph, Omar, who of course was the arch covenant breaker. He was the second covenant breaker, and he was offered to be the third caliph if he would accept all the decisions that the first two caliphs had made, and he refused. And of course, what he wanted to do, among other things, and he did do many things, was to show everyone the Quran as it was meant to be, in the correct order. And of course, he had memorized every surah, and he had also discussed with Muhammad the meaning of the most abstruse surah in particular. And if you remember last time, or perhaps it was a couple of times ago, but at any rate, at the Pool of Khum, he told the followers, the believers, that they should study the surah that were plain and obvious, but they should leave it to Ali to interpret and explain the abstruse surah. So that's one source of the Sharia, the Quran, but not as it was intended, but as they interpreted it. And we get to the question, as who interpreted it? Well, the caliphs had authority, the highest authority, but then they had advisors underneath them. The hadiths. Now, the hadiths are traditions, as we've said before. They're stories told about those who were with Muhammad and heard what he said and wrote it down. But the only hadiths that we really care much about are those that are authenticated a process that took place years later. And so they really, from a Baha'i point of view, have as much authority, the ones that are authenticated and agreed upon by both Sunni and Shia, as the Quran. Because we know from the Baha'i teachings, everything the manifestation says and does has some divine purpose. The Sunnah are the habits, are customs, or comportment of the Prophet. They're derived largely from the hadiths themselves, but they're open to interpretation. That is, since the Prophet is an exemplar whose life is subject to specific circumstances, you can hardly use the things that the Prophet, that everything the Prophet did as a guide for how we should comport ourselves, because we're not capable of doing it. Though obviously every manifestation, as the Baha'i writings say, is the exemplar of his own teachings. And of course, in the Baha'i teachings, we are fortunate in the Baha'i history to have an ordinary human being, Abdul Baha, who was the perfect exemplar as well. So we have someone, since we don't know much about, since Baha'u'llah was mostly secluded, revealing the works for this dispensation, the public persona, if you will, of the exemplary Baha'i was Abdul Baha, and he purposefully so. These are the 5 pillars of Islam as they're commonly understood, and they have to do with the declaration of your faith, that you are a Muslim. Of course, there's the tradition of taqiyya, which means in a moment of endangerment, you can deny that you're a Muslim. This is something that Baha'u'llah abrogates. A Baha'i cannot deny his or her faith. Obligatory prayer, and there are 5 prayers each day at dawn, mid-morning, noon, afternoon, and midnight. Compulsory giving, which is alms, giving of alms, fasting during the month of Ramadan, and pilgrimage to Mecca if one is able. The 5 pillars are alluded to in the Quran, and some are even specifically stated in the Quran, like the Hajj to Mecca. However, the difference in practice of these traditions are accepted in Islam of the 5 pillars, but this does not mean they have all existed since the life of Muhammad. Now, I'm going to stop here, but let me show you what is coming, because I am going to leave this on the slides so you can see them for next time. We're going to see how the law is devised, and there are various processes, and it's very interesting. One is by consensus. One is by analogical reasoning, or just reason, in the case of Shia jurisprudence, because they don't recognize the analogical reasoning, but just reasoning, as you can see down here. And then we go through the various developments of the Sharia.